All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Polytalk EDU. And today we have the distinct pleasure to having Professor Robert Yowell being as a guest for this episode today. Welcome aboard, Robert.
Thank you.
Yes. Today, just we are just inside 3 weeks of the upcoming election on November 5th. And then there's a lot of speculations going on how we got here, what is going to be going on. I just want to have a general broad perspective on what you think about the current election thus far.
Well, it's about as close as it can possibly get, it seems. It's an interesting contest in the fact that there's both real substantive debate on certain issues, and there's some real genuine personal conflicts going on between the two nominees and the two parties. So there's certainly something for everybody here. It's by no means dull. I think if it were a blowout, it would be a different type of discussion. But I think I think some of the intensity may be a product of the fact that it's this close.
Now, just kind of, it's very interesting in terms of gauge it and compare it to other elections in the past, where actually a sitting president is not running for re-election. To me, it sounds like it's what happened in 1968, when Johnson kind of decided not to run again. Why do you think the Biden situation, the fact that he decided to not run, was he pushed out, or what's your perspective on the fact that it's?
I think it's doubtless that he was pushed out. I think the polling data and the public perception after that debate was so overwhelmingly negative that I think that the Democratic Party leadership across the board, from congressional leaders, campaign, staffers, to anyone who wanted to do well in the election, I think that they saw that their chances in keeping the president in that position were greatly diminished. And there's a gamble there, right? I mean, it might end up that whomever you choose to be the replacement nominee ends up being even less popular. But I think that at the time, it seemed to those who had the ability to convince the president to step down that had it not been for that happening, their chances would have been just too low to be competitive. I don't think this is something that the president did willingly. I think he had to be convinced, and I think the people around him had to be convinced. But I think that came from within party leadership, and that it was a lengthy and detailed persuasive process.
Yeah, and a lot of people thought it was what really kind of made the major difference at the end was the performance of Biden in the debate. And people thought, he did not do well enough. And people thought, in all things considered, if he would have done this kind of like step aside before the convention, and then to have people rally against, with Harris at that point, but that did not happen. So if it wasn't for the debate and then the obvious fatigue, issue that he had to deal with, things would have been a little different. It was very obvious. A lot of people, the dealership, like Nancy Pelosi and everybody else, was not really enchanted by the perspective of him being the final nominee, which is really kind of an interesting thing. But considering this historical, moment when Harris has to step in, do you think that she did everything that she could to be as popular as she can be in unifying the Democratic Party, and also to try to be appealing to people who actually are in the middle? What do you think she's done, and what she needs to do between now and the election?
It's interesting. When you look at recently Gallup took a measurement, this is probably in early September, late August, about enthusiasm, the relative enthusiasm of voters of either party going into this election. At that point, shortly after she became the nominee, whether it was de facto or officially ratified at the convention, the excitement among Democrats was 15, 16 points higher than Republicans, which is something we haven't seen since 2008. Now, I think that is not long lasting. I think there's an exuberance that happens in the short run. But either way, I think unifying people within the party, at least people who declare themselves Democrats, maybe not so much with Democrat leaners, I think she's done that. And I think to a certain degree, Donald Trump has done that because he's enough of a polarizing figure that he probably shored up a lot of Democrat support that might have been likely to stay home. I don't think they would have voted for former President Trump, but the worry is your softer supporters stay home. Now, has the vice president done much to convince people who are more middle of the road, maybe soft Democratic supporters or soft Republican supporters? You've seen this recently with some of her policy proposals. They seem to be geared towards people at the middle of the road. She certainly has tempered some of the positions that she took when she ran for president in 2020. And I think that's an acknowledgement that elections that are likely to be this close will, the roles played by people in the middle who aren't as polarized will be key to the outcome. Is it enough? I don't say, but certainly you can see efforts on her part and the part of her campaign to try to reach people. She didn't run left. I mean, if you look at the position she's taken since becoming the nominee compared to when she ran against Biden in the primary, very different positions. I don't think that she's changed. I think it's an acknowledgement that as a primary candidate, you have to make a different outreach from if you are a general election nominee. And she's done that. Is what it amounts to, I think, remains to be seen. But I think absent that, it would have been even harder for her to be competitive in this race.
Okay, all right. Now, we have to consider something. I mean, no president, from the Republicans or the Democratic side were able to win without having the help of people who actually not really have a strong affiliation with the Republicans or the Democrats. So we're talking about the people who actually have a third party, affiliation, or maybe they are independent. At the current era that we have, maybe we don't have a strong third party, as in the case of 1992 Ross Perot impact. But we do have like Jill Stein. We have also RFK, which actually doing what he did. Based on the demographics today on the third party candidacy, who has a better appeal to actually get more third parties kind of affiliation?
That's tough because the third parties, there's a few of them that are so ideologically different from each other, and their numbers are so small, it's hard for me to say. I think one of two things is likely to happen. One, third party supporters throw their support behind one of the two major nominees. Now, this is assuming their people aren't on the ballot because they aren't universally on the ballot in every state. I think what's more likely is a lot of these folks stay home or they go and they cast a protest vote. And I'm not sure what effect it has. It's been fascinating, the legal battles with people like Cornel West, Jill Stein, RFK Jr., of which states they'll be on the ballot and which states they won't. I think there may be a couple states at most where the people who are inclined to support them play spoiler, or else it's close enough to where it's worth talking about. But it's hard for me to see it as having a measurable effect. Now, whenever a race is close, you're going to find some small group that to blame if it doesn't come out your way. I'm not sure that's what's going to happen. I think my general perspective is in any election, if you've lost, it's because your less ardent supporters have stayed home and something chased out your opponent's leaners to the polls that you weren't able to capture. And there may be nothing that you can do as a campaign to overcome that. For instance, I don't think there's anything the McCain campaign could have done in 2008 to overcome the uphill battle of the economy, et cetera. But I don't think, and again, this year it looks to be a lot closer. But I don't think it's going to be won or lost by your third party voters deciding one way or the other. I think it's going to be what proportion of the Democrat and Republican leaners decide to stay home.
Okay. And this current election, The one that was actually getting the most attention was RFK Jr. And then
Sure.
knowing what he did, I mean, he was trying to kind of like to try to, talk to the Harris campaign to kind of like give them his support, and that did not work out. And then he kind of went the other way. In many ways, he acted not as a third party candidate. He acted like in the primaries, like somebody losing for the top of the
Right.
ticket, and then actually. So you think his support, his apparent support to Donald Trump, is that going to translate into his followers following through and then voting for Trump or not?
A campaign maxim I learned younger by campaign people who may not always look at this academically is that endorsements are never as powerful as issues. I don't know if the Trump campaign is the same on as many issues as RFK's supporters to make a difference. It might be, but most American voters, especially third-party people who have I think they have a stronger sense of not wanting to be part of large groups, or not persuaded by organization per se. It's hard for me to see those voters as, since RFK told me to, I'm going to vote this way. I think a lot of the appeal RFK had to people, the same reason why a Cornel West or a Jill Stein would, is he connects with them on some really important issues that if they're no longer relevant, then I think to most of their voters, the issue has been dropped, and neither Republican or Democrat may stand out. It's just hard to know. That I don't think endorsements are all that important, but RFK has enough support out there, and if a handful of his people decide to entrust in his leadership, it may be enough here and there. Once again, everything I say is tempered by the fact that if the election is as close as it appears, tiny numbers here and there, or at least tiny percentage points, can sway outcomes.
Okay. Now, oftentimes in previous elections, we often talk about the October surprise. We are in the middle of October. We're only 3 weeks out. Have we had all the surprises that we anticipating, or there's still going to have a one big drop? And who's like trying to have the election as soon as possible before another surprise is going to kind of drop on us?
It's hard for me to imagine there not being another surprise. But I think at this point, whatever surprise drops will be dubious enough that it's probably going to have a diminished effect. I don't know. I think most voters who have decided at this point to vote in favor of the person they're more inclined to, I'm not sure, given how different the two nominees are, the parties, and how intense the politics are, it's hard for me to imagine it doing more than creating noise. Now, it might have an effect on the small number of people that are truly independent and might be swayed one way or the other. It seems like that's less likely. And my guess is it will be less important than the fundamentals that are already in place. And I think the closer we get to the election day, the more likely the surprise is to be, I don't want to say a hoax, but will be misrepresented to the point where it's not so much a surprise as it is an attempt to make news out of something that we probably already know or has been misrepresented.
Okay. Now, also from a historical perspective, when somebody votes at the presidential election, they vote basically sometimes based on personality versus competence. In the past, like people like just voted the charisma. There's the way, like the Reagan and then the Reagan Democrats in 1984. In this atypical election we have it now, the average voter is going to vote for either Harris or Trump. Are they voting on the sheer personality, or is it maybe a specific issue, a platform that they are gravitating toward? Is it still a personality contest, or is it personality versus competence?
I think the issues and how the two nominees align first and foremost. And then I think that their personalities can intensify it or dull it. I think to most Democratic voters who might consider the fact of sitting it out, I think that their personal distaste for Donald Trump is probably quite strong, and it's likely to to do that. Now, on top of that, if they had a charismatic attraction to their nominee, it can reinforce that further. I think on both sides, your softer Republican supporters, softer Democratic supporters, I think the personality of the other side's nominee is a negative enough of a factor that's tended to drive it to where maybe it's the election of anti-charisma that the policies and the positions matter, but I think both nominees and their personal styles is having an effect not so much on motivating their own people, but intensifying the idea that people who are on the other side feel the need to come out, not so much because they just are genuinely enthralled and want to see their person win, but they're voting more out of protection of interest because they have a greater distaste than usual for the other person. And I think negative ads are a manifestation of that, right? I think you'd be focusing on a whole lot more positivity if you believed your own nominee had the charisma to build greater support among those who align with that person's policies. And we don't see a whole lot here in Texas because Texas is less competitive than most states. But most of what I've seen as far as samples on the internet, there seems to be a lot of negativity, which I think is consistent with the idea that you're trying to remind people of the other party who may come out and vote, yeah, your person is just kind of nasty, so stay home. And I think counter mobilization is a strategy. And when you only have 65%, and that's in a big year like 2020, during COVID, where it was a lot easier to vote than previous years, I think with 35% of the people at a minimum likely to stay home, I think a strategy of getting the other side supporters to stay home with some of that negativity is part of the strategy.
Yeah. And you can actually certainly see that in the rhetoric in the past few elections, as opposed to from a historical standpoint. A lot of times in the past, people are saying, vote for me because I'm good. Or Donald Reagan, when he coined the phrase, if you're better off today than you were 4 years ago, you know who to vote for. But right now they're very open about like, hey, maybe I'm not perfect, but look at my alternative. And they're running on that issue. It's like they're trying to say, I'm not perfect, but the other person is much worse, which is kind of like very unorthodox when it comes to American election. And Biden actually was saying that, and Trump as well. It's like, I'm not perfect, but if you're going to go with the other side, look what they're going to do to you. You know.
Sure.
So what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's a part of its personality, but I think if you replaced either nominee with somebody else, I still think it'd be a large part of the campaign. That the two parties have moved so far apart in the last 20, 30 years that the us and them mentality is more intense. There's a whole lot less empathy among the electorate as well as the campaigners, to where that becomes a viable case. Is I don't really have to tell you what I want, but the other person is so unacceptable that it doesn't matter what my policies are, I'm not that other person. And that is different from, we've studied in political science that whenever you have competitive races, at least at the state level, you tend to see bidding wars where the two parties promise more friendly policies broadly across the electorate, to where you're offering up a set of policies that people will weigh in relation to what the other nominee is offering up. There is some of that this time, but I think you're right. A lot more of it is, I may not be what you wanted, right? But I'm far less dangerous than the other person is to your interests, whatever your interests are. And so, it's certainly a departure from some of the more policy-driven campaigns of yesteryear.
Okay. Now, I look at this from a historical standpoint again, and I do believe that the road to the White House for the Republican nominee, whoever that is, in many ways, it seems, demographically speaking, it seems to be a little easier than the road to the presidency from a Democratic perspective, because I'm not generalizing, but I think we could probably say that the average Republican voter is, or the community itself, the constituency for the Republicans, are more homogeneous than the Democratic side. Democratic side is always on, it's a coalition, it's very heterogeneous. And then in this day and age, it's like, for instance, if you want to, how are we going to be able to, for the Republicans, you know exactly what you're going to do demographically. You're going to hit like 3 or 4 issues. You're going to maybe capture 85% of the people who are going to vote Republican anyway. For the Democratic side, it's a little bit different. It's like a very fragmented community. And then if you're going to weigh heavy on one side, the other side is going to kind of get upset, even like bringing international relations into it. And then the current like wars we're involved in, like Russia versus Ukraine, Israel and Hamas, and Israel and Hezbollah. If you go, your policy is going to gear toward one side, the other side is going to get kind of bothered by the whole thing. And then they are part of the same coalition for the Democratic side. So what's your take on that, on the homogeneous impact and then the heterogeneous impact from the Republican versus Democrats?
That's tough because the homogeneity versus heterogeneity is probably true on ethnicity. But when it comes to economics and policy, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in both parties. Now, the micro targeting, when you going after people once you know their religion, their age, their income, their ethnicity, their sex, that I think the reason why campaigns do that is if you know a lot about somebody, you have an inclination of how they're going to vote. But I think a lot of that is stirring up turnout rather than designing policies. But I think you're right in the fact that, and when you brought up foreign policy, I think right now with the Democrats in particular, there's a lot more heterogeneity in foreign policy preference, especially when you look at the conflict around Israel, that you have certain areas of support among Democrats that are much less friendly to Israel than others. And it's hard to please both of them because that historic conflict has not been too prone to compromise. So on that front, but foreign policy voting, I think that may be important to a few people here and there, but I still think it's largely going to come down to economics. So I don't know. You have the very well-off people, super well-off people who tend to support Democrats, the relatively well-off people who tend to be Republican, and then below that, it's kind of a mix. I don't know, a lot of the things like blue collar, white collar, college degree, non-college degree, a lot of that stuff is shuffled recently, and it's hard to make sense of. It may be less of who you make an appeal to as the two parties, as who is currently suffering and who they think is more like them. I'm not sure how to make sense of that. But I think if you try to engineer your outreach, the more specific you get, the greater likely you are to you're going to alienate somebody. Then again, if you don't reach out to groups that want certain things, and then you've lost opportunity. So I think with the Democrats on that one, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think they're more likely to have to do it. And I think historically they've done it quite well, at least in the past 20 years or so. But this year may be difficult because some of those schisms within the party, especially among union workers, you've seen that's really changed in their level of support. And then some of the foreign policy issues, especially around Southwest Asia, that it's hard because it's hard to please two sides of an issue within your own party on something that intense. That may end up being a deciding factor in Michigan, because Michigan's probably is the state that I'm thinking about that has, a higher population of Muslim voters than other states.
Right, and then particularly Dearborn, Michigan. Yeah, I mean the Pennsylvania, right. Pockets of Pennsylvania, but Michigan is the one, right, that actually had the most of the Arab American and Muslim community living in there, and they're actually very open about saying if we don't change the policy about who you're supporting, we're not going to re-elect you, or not going to go to cast our votes for you. And then the other side is actually the Harris side is relying on the fact, even though you may not like my policy, but Donald Trump policy regarding that issue is probably going to be even more draconian or more even worse. So in many ways, like they're still trying to use that I'm the lesser of the two evils, argument in both sides. So
I was surprised yesterday in the interview, the Fox interview, that the vice president gave, how
Right.
she wasn't specific, but she was clear that we're going to give Israel the support it needs, which was less subtle, less nuanced than earlier statements that the administration and the campaign have made, which have been, we will support Israel up to, or Israel better ensure first. You didn't see that yesterday. Now, that might have been a spontaneous answer that we received clarification from in coming days. But at the time, I thought this is interesting, and the map of Michigan flashed in front of my head of that there may be some fallout from that. But that goes along with what you've mentioned. It can be hard to keep a coalition together if you alienate part of those that are part of that heterogeneous community.
We're going to come back to this toward the end about the foreign policy and what's your anticipation, which leadership will be, kind of like better leadership in terms of subsiding all the drama and the trauma that's taking place in the Middle East and in all over the world. I'm going to talk about the vice presidential selection for both candidates. Usually, when you select somebody, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's like a very. It was surprising, for instance, when Reagan picked Bush. They just really attacked each other. They did not like each other. Also, the selection of maybe John F. Kennedy to Johnson, they did not like each other, but it was specifically serves a purpose. What's your take on the selection of the current potentially vice presidents of the United States? What did they pick? Who they picked? Did they pick wisely, or they think they could have done better? Both sides.
My guess is that Vice President Harris chose Governor Walz largely out of geography, maybe demographics, but I think a lot of it was to shore up support in the Great Lakes area. I know a lot of the experts, especially the experts who were on the Democrat side, thought that Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania would have been a better choice politically. He's little more polished in his media exposure. Just came off a pretty big victory in a state that's competitive. He's he can mobilize votes. And I know there's speculation that having a Jewish vice president might have caused some of the issues that you mentioned, that might alienate certain voters. It's hard to know what's in the heart of somebody when they make a choice. I think if I were just looking at the Electoral College, I thought Shapiro would have been a more likely choice. But I don't have nearly as many people in the room where I was thinking about this that I'm sure the Harris campaign. And I don't think this was throwing darts. I think this came after a lot of careful consideration. Now, as far as J.D. Vance on the Republican side, pardon me while I get the lights back on.
Yeah.
There were some of the other names that I heard of were Marco Rubio, which in a way makes sense, but I think the Republicans are counting on Florida, so that diminishes that. Besides the fact that J.D. Vance, I think electorally, J.D. Vance's big appeal is that he's about as close to a blue-collar Republican as you see in elected politics, at least with nationwide focus.
Sure.
And reaching out to blue-collar voters, especially in a Great Lakes area state, is a huge part of the strategy. I know the Republicans, they feel they need to get back Georgia, Arizona, and one of the Great Lakes states. And J.D. Vance fits that profile. Also, I think Ohio, even though it leans red, there's a very important Senate race where Sherrod Brown is running for re-election. Sure. And it looks like a pretty close contest, and having Vance on the ticket might have been at least partially to influence that Senate race by turning out Republicans in that state. A lot of factors go into it. I don't think either one of them made a particularly bad choice. I know there's criticism of it, but I don't know. That's part of the problem with coverage of all this stuff is everyone has a bone to pick. And when there's 25 different ostensible people you could take, That means there's a lot of people upset that you didn't pick the person that they thought was the right pick. So I don't think there was anything outlandish about either of them. I think there's strategy going on that's consistent with. I think when you look at a map of where both teams need to win, you know, Governor Walz, I should put the Governor Walz and J.D. Vance are at the opposite end of that area geographically, and I think that's a lot of it. The Electoral College is it's here, and winning some of those states, if not all of those states, is going to be key to it. Now that I've said that, North Carolina somehow is going to decide the election.
Right. Now, what about the fact that the top of the ticket for the Republican Party, 78, 79-year-old Trump, and then he picked J.D. Vance, who's 39. And then also a lot of people think J.D. Vance is just as conservative. I mean, I know he's projected the blue collar, side of things from the Republican side, but he's just as conservative, even if not more, maybe even more out of convictions, conservative. As in the case of Donald Trump, he was able to make the nomination for the Supreme Court justices to kind of like get rid of Roe v. Wade and replace that with the Dobbs decision. But that seems to be kind of like Donald Trump is maybe I'm not a religious person, but look what I have done. But actually, J.D. Vance is actually, he's a living proof of that. So you think that impacted the choice for Donald Trump, or it just kind of like that was icing on the cake?
I think in 2016, the Trump choice had to reach out to conservatives in the party to make them believe that that's how Trump was going to govern. Because
as an insurance policy almost,
his ideology from when we were introduced to him, I don't know, late 70s or something, has not been clear. Right. And so to have somebody that gives that ideological verification, or you said insurance policy, seemed to make sense. And Governor Pence was conservative, not that well known to drive a lot of people either way. It was just, oh, okay, we've heard he's conservative. I think at this point, former President Trump is has to do that less than he did, because most of the Republicans saw how he governed, and even if he may not have those personal convictions on conservatism, where the ball lands after he hits it tends to be in a relatively conservative position. So I think there's something else going on with Vance. I think youth had to be part of it. An up-and-coming politician who's well-spoken. I mean, their temperaments are very different from each other. If you looked at both of them in the debates, very, very different ways of relating to people.
Sure.
With whom they disagree. So I think there's a lot going on there. But I don't think that Trump has to reach out to conservatives anymore. But I think at the same time, he can't alienate middle-of-the-road conservative-ish people, or those who might be open to it, with someone who is more firebrand. Like imagine a Matt Gaetz out of Florida, or I'm trying to think of somebody else. Had to pick somebody who was genuinely conservative, but a lot more of a probably a friendlier personality. And I think that's something that Vance tried to show in that debate, that he had substantively, he was certainly conservative, but he approached his differences with Governor Walz a little bit differently than you would see former President Trump do on the debate stage.
Yes, absolutely. And then it reminds me, this aside from the age and then the different regions and the different demographics, where you actually elect someone actually almost the same as you ideologically. It reminds me of the 1992 election when Clinton picked Al Gore. It's kind of like, both were young, both from southern states. One as a governor, was as a senator. But I mean, honestly, Al Gore did not really offer that much more to the Clinton, ticket. But he just kind of was comfortable with the way they were, and both young guys, as opposed George Bush had Dan Quayle. The age thing was an issue, and different demographics as well. So it's kind of like a replica of, in many ways, it's similar to what happened in 1992 in terms of picking someone that you want to run alongside you. and then they believe pretty much the same thing. Obviously, the style is different. There's a lot big differences between obviously Gore and Clinton, but
Sure.
on the major issues, they pretty much project the same thing. Okay, now if Trump wins, actually, that would be the second time. I mean, since Cleveland, he actually won two non-consecutive, administrations. What is the likelihood? What do you think if the election is held soon? Basically based on what we know today, not withholding any major October surprises. The election is held tomorrow. What are the chances of Trump?
I think it's close to 50-50, but if the election were held today, I would say maybe 52% Trump, 48% Harris. Some of the trends lately in the polls have moved towards Trump, and usually the polls are a couple days behind mood. Do you believe in such a thing? Mm-hmm. I think it's not different enough from 50-50, though, to really claim a number. I think right now it is pretty darn close to 50-50.
Yeah, it's within the margin of error.
It's hard to tell.
52,
yeah. And the polls margin of error is meaningless right now because they're so close to each other. The question is, are the polls systemically biased as they have been in the last couple elections? And I don't mean that pollsters are trying to fool us. It's hard to get good polling when you get about 5% participation. You end up with really skewed samples, and you adjust those samples based on your assumptions, which may not hold anymore. I mean, think the 2016 polls were biased, but it was slight. I mean, the differences in the key states between Clinton and Trump were within the margin of error, but they were all wrong in the same direction, which led Trump to pick up those 3 or 4 states we didn't think he would. In 2020, the systemic bias in favor of Biden was actually more than it was in 2016, but it was less than what Biden was actually leading by. So we haven't really talked about it much because the polls named the right winner, although they were more inaccurate. Now, did pollsters make corrections after 2016? Yes, and they got even worse results. Have they made corrections after 2020? I'm sure they have. Will the results be better? Maybe. I don't know. But certainly, I would not dare to say convincingly, oh, they're off by this much or they're off by that direction. I'm just prepared for them to have been off. I just don't know how much or which direction. And that's what it's probably going to come down to, is the measurement is getting harder to do. And since the candidates appear to be so close, even if the measurement's right on, scientific measurement has that margin of error that's inescapable. And so who knows right now? So the short form to your question, 50% chance that he wins.
Well, I guess the same goes the same goes for Harris as well. Yeah.
Yeah, or I would maybe say 49 chance for each of them, and then there's maybe a 1 or 2% chance of something else happening. Right. Eventually, one of them will be named president. I'm just not sure it's going to happen the first week of November.
Okay. Now, what would you take as and Donald Trump one time he mentioned something that he was being accused of being going to be like a dictator, autocratic leader, and he said only on day one. Is that something? I mean, he said he's going to be like a dictator only on day one. What does that really mean? And should that really matter? I mean, peaceful transformation. I mean, what's your take on him saying that?
One thing that I've found from studying politics is people tend to label others as dictators if they're trying to push anything whatsoever. Now, the idea that anyone's going to be a dictator is just silly in the United States system, because you have all the checks and balances that exist. And you have to have a lot of cooperation. Think about Richard Neustadt. The only power that the president has is the power of persuasion. Now, will he come in and rescind executive orders, pass new ones? Absolutely. But that's if that's the measure of a dictator, then every president we've had since Clinton has been something of a dictator. Now, dictating immigration procedure. That's part of what the president does. Now, that's different from, for instance, a dictator, as we've seen throughout history, where you're arresting people for thought crimes or not being or not conforming to expectations. I don't know. I think a lot of the dictator stuff is meaningless because the way it ends, what people consider to be dictator-like behavior is largely politicians being successful and getting things done, which may be a wonderful thing if you like those policies. They can be horrific if you don't. But our system allows very little for the president to do on their own should they win. So I'm not, what left to their own devices, would any president do a lot more than they've done? Sure, but I just don't think that the possibility largely exists, especially considering all the various checks on the control and the pathways of power that exist in Washington. There's a lot of people, almost everyone has to say yes to a very bad decision for it to be followed through. It doesn't take that many people to say no. So I think a lot of it's bluster. Also, I'm not always sure when that guy is joking, exaggerating, or telling the truth. So it's hard to know. But our system is set up to prevent that sort of thing. And I think it's more of a campaign strategy to say that I'm less of a threat than that other person. I may be a threat to you, but the other person is the ultimate threat. And so I take that stuff with a grain of salt. I mean, maybe I'm a little naive that our system is that self-correcting, but I mean, you think about the presidents who have exerted the most power over history. It was usually short-lived. It was usually in a crisis. I think of Lincoln, Wilson, FDR in particular. And I don't see that happening again, given what we've learned. And a lot of people genuinely suffered during those conflicts. But the idea that you're going to have a single president just, making people disappear who disagree with him, I don't think that's a very realistic threat.
Okay. Now, normally in the second term as a president, and normally like in a two consecutive administrations, usually you see like the true color of the president in the second half, the second term, because they're not running for re-election, and then you can see what they have done. So Trump has served already 4 years. How do you see a different Donald Trump if they manage to win? Is he going to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more tamed? What do you project the a presidency of Donald Trump the second time around, if he wins?
I think I see a little more aggression. I think he's going to have a chip on his shoulder from what he sees as been maligned, especially if he wins a narrow contest. On the other hand, if you remember back during the Trump administration, there was a huge amount of investigation, of judicial fiats, all sorts of people in other areas who have check and balance power, pushing to make it difficult for him to accomplish things. I think it's going to be revved up on both sides. And I think our system has a very strong bias towards status quo, and that it would be hard for him to get all that much done, because all the resistance that he faced that left him short of obtaining his goals 4 years ago, it's going to happen again. And I think the same thing would happen with a President Harris. Now, if you have both branches, both chambers of Congress, that helps, although the filibuster, should it survive, helps get in the way. But I think what I really expect to see is a lot more judicial activism over the next 4 years, regardless of who wins, because that's become the new battleground of checking policy. Are these district court judges who used to only issue writs of mandamus related to cases they had open, but that's no longer the case anymore. You have individuals, in the Ninth Circuit issuing nationwide stays. So I see whoever wins, and I think Trump's more likely than Harris to push hard, given he's already been there and he's learned from what didn't work last time. But I think you're going to get a Newtonian equal and opposite reaction from the other side in trying to check those things.
Okay. Do you think that's a real thing that Donald Trump might, he has 4 years to do it, maybe try to change the 22nd Amendment in terms of, would that be,
Good luck,
is that a
right?
realistic thing?
I don't think it can happen, though. 13 states will stop it. All you need is 13 states to say no. And I can assure you, he's going to lose at fewest 13 states next month. So unless there becomes some huge groundswell across the US of love for him among people that didn't before, it's going to be hard. Now, that's the second step of the amendment, right? You have to start off with a 2/3 of Congress or a convention called by 2/3 of the states. That seems hugely far-fetched. And he, I don't know, if it would seem like a waste of time to advocate for it. Although it would not surprise me if there becomes conjecture and argumentation that his first term was largely deprived of him through all of the resistance, that he didn't have a first term, which I think is more likely to happen than trying to change the Constitution. I don't know. I don't see that going anywhere. I think the math is just so strongly against it that it's unlikely to happen.
Okay. And speaking of math and speaking of majority, I mean, twice, the Democrats tried to impeach Trump, and then twice he was impeached in the House, twice he was exonerated in the Senate. You think if it just so happened that Trump is gonna, let's say, lose, the Democrats are gonna win both houses, you think the likelihood of having another impeachment, is that gonna be looming, or, are we done with the impeachment talk?
I think it'll be 100% likely. In fact, when the lame duck period of 2016, early 2017, when Trump won and President Obama was on his way out of office, that was already the talk in news. It was talk in the Democratic Party to impeach him. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think if Democrats hold either chamber, especially the House, I think, and Trump is president, there will be 4 years, a 4-year impeachment hearing, essentially. That will be something constant, because if you can, even if you don't impeach the person, and of course convicting is even more far-fetched, tying someone down in hearings and airing out criticisms of the president is a tried and true congressional method for slowing down what it is they want to do. It may have been asymmetrical in recent years. Let's not forget the Republicans impeached Bill Clinton back in 98.
98, yes.
It's a common strategy. That's one of the checks and balances. Probably not the way the framers intended it to. But the more that you investigate the executive branch and you make the debate about possible wrongdoing, the harder it is for the executive branch to make a case that what it wants is necessary. Because why would a person who's having to show up to hearings and explain themselves want something good? So I think the Democrats are more likely to engage in that in the House than the Republicans would. But I think it's something that's not going away, is this constant investigation and the allegation of wrongdoing as a way to slow the progress of the president's party. But if it's President Trump and Democrats hold the House, I think impeachment hearings will begin almost instantaneously.
Could that be said the same way for Harris? If Harris wins, is it a possibility?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the Republicans in the House probably, there'll be some who are pushing forward hard. The Freedom Caucus, some of the more conservative ones. The leadership is probably a little less likely to push it than or to allow it to be pushed than the Democratic leadership. But I think the Republicans will be ready to pounce, to use a common media term. And I think that what would trigger investigation hearings, at least, would be right there. Investigations on impeachment for President Biden already started, and now it kind of seems like a moot point. But I don't think the Republicans would shy away from it, but I think the threshold for beginning it might be a little higher, just given that I think the ill will is not symmetrical. I think between the parties it is, but between the vice president and the Republicans in the House versus the former president, Democrats in the House, I don't think that ill will is symmetrical. I think it's a little heavier in one direction.
Okay. Now, I get asked this question a lot. I'm sure you do as well, and for our students and then people that we, talk to about politics. An average person, let's say somebody who does not have a strong affiliation to the Republican or the Democrats, and they're in the middle, and they are really want to participate, they want to vote, and they want to exercise that right, but they really don't have a candidate. I mean, maybe the third party candidate that they have, they either dropped out of the race or they don't have a realistic shot of winning. What do you tell that average person who has non-strong affiliation? How would you cast your vote? You stay home, you vote for the lesser of the two evils, or you vote your conscience knowing that your candidate is not going to win anyway. What would we tell those individuals?
As an employee of the state of Texas and academic who teaches government political science, I'm not comfortable saying, well, just stay home. If you don't care, why are you casting a chaotic vote if you don't know it's in your self-interest? But I think that goes against what we teach about social and personal responsibility, that you have a job to do as a citizen to cast a vote one way or the other and figure out what your vote ought to be. And I think if you look enough at the two nominees in any contest, despite what distaste you may have for them, eventually you'll learn enough to know that this person is a lot more likely to pursue your interest than the other person. Or I would much rather not have to deal with 4 years of speeches of this person than the other one. The differences are there. I mean, the Republicans and Democrats and the people they nominate in almost every race are getting increasingly different. And if it's hard to see the difference between the two of them, then look for 5 or 6 more seconds, just a handful more of pointing and clicking, you'll find the differences. Now, yeah, are they your ideal person? That third party person, that West, that Stein, that RFK? No, they aren't that person. But it's not a contest between what you would prefer if it were solely up to you and nobody. That all your fellow Americans, through a series of nomination processes and state primaries, have decided these are the two people. And you may not like that process and what it led to in the two viable nominees, but that's the choice. And I think it's not too hard to come up with preferring one of them because you have a sound reason to do so. Now, if we were talking about a city council race, there'd be a lot more difficulty for you in doing that. But at least for a presidential race, it's hard to think that you would end up not having a preference. And I know there are protest voters, and I've had plenty of people in life who are like that. But I think that's more of an exercise in ego rather than an expression of a democratic norm. So, get involved, get in the game. And by gosh, if you don't vote, you probably ought to not be complaining to anybody about it because you had a choice and you decided not to choose. Well, it's let the people who made the decision discuss the decision.
Right. Now, oftentimes we put our thinking hats on and we say, well, the founding fathers had this in the intent of the Constitution when it was written and all that stuff. Well, based on like Madison and then his writings, they don't talk about political parties per se, but they talk about factions, which is translated into modern day political parties. So almost 240 years ago, 237 to be exact. Do you think the founding fathers envisioned us having only two-party system, or were we supposed to be built to be a multi-party system? That could be a 45 minutes conversation, but I mean,
yeah, I don't think they could have foreseen mass media the way that we have it today. The idea of wires and satellites and microwaves and the way that we can instantaneously communicate. I mean, heck, the news now is what will happen as opposed to what just happened. And back then, news took a couple weeks to travel across the country. And so I think they envisioned regional parties regional factions in a way that the elites like themselves would have to sort out some of these differences, making sure that no faction could dominate over the others, but there would be enough factions
And
that
to force like a
there
kind of
have to
a
be
coalition, you know? Yeah.
right. So, but then again, they did form only two parties pretty quickly because they, you know, and this is largely of their own doing. They didn't mention parties in the Constitution. They feared parties, but as soon as all these folks in Philadelphia got to Congress, they formed two parties because they realized on most of the issues you vote yay or you vote nay, and a lot of us have commonality on more than just one or two issues. And just as it takes a majority to build a winning coalition for an election, it takes a majority to build a winning coalition for legislation. And so it turns out parties were just easy ways of getting people together to win. And so I don't know if they thought that the two-party system would be a fixture, at least nationwide, I think within the halls of Congress. So I think that they could, the idea of instantaneous communications like what we're having here would have blown their minds. The idea that, you know, how could someone in Massachusetts or I guess New Hampshire communicate with a Georgian? Wouldn't they need horses? And so,
Right.
So enough has changed. Then again, the two-party system hasn't changed all that much. We've shuffled on some issues and some regions, but it's, with very few exceptions, it's been pretty much a two-party system with a handful of interruptions or reshuffling. I mean, as popular as Teddy Roosevelt was, he didn't do all that well when he ran as a third party. You mentioned Ross Perot, who achieved across two elections 0 electoral votes. There's something mathematical behind it that it's self-perpetuating. That maybe the framers didn't envision, but they wrote the rules for elections. I mean, for the most part, that was the standard, winner take all elections. The two-party system tends to be the norm. Even in the UK, that allegedly has multi-parties, really there's only two viable parties in any one area. When you start to throw in the Ulsters and the Scottish party, they become the conservative and labor substitutes. But I mean, I think you saw what in the last UK election, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the reason why, I mean, conservatives earned more votes than the Labor Party, but they lost because what's the name of the party? It's not the Liberal Party, it's Farage's party. They took enough votes away that the winner take all deprived the conservatives of the numbers they needed. And I think there's a reshuffling going there right now. I don't think it's as big as our 1860 because their issues are somewhat muted. But you know, building a coalition of a majority is a necessary mechanism in a popular sovereignty to have legitimacy. And if you can't do that, you're going to have trouble. And I don't see with the winner-take-all election scheme how you can have a multi-party system where parties are viable if they can't maintain something close to a majority. Maybe in a proportional system like Germany or France or something. But here, I think that winner-take-all has not locked it, but made it very difficult to escape.
Yeah, and it seems like when it comes to third-party, nominations, it seems that the more success you have as a third party, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning the 1912 and the 1992 elections, they were a moderate success. I mean, TR and then Ross Perot, and it seems like they did so much success that they influenced the election. They did not win the election, obviously, but they tend to influence the election to go one way or another. It seems to be they are labeled as a spoiler. Like a lot of times, like TR, it seems like one of his a tarnish in his legacy is he ran against Taft, and he was able to deliver the presidency to Wilson, which Wilson would not have won if they kept their coalition together and did not like introduce the Moose Party. And the same for Ross Perot.
I'm less likely to say that for Ross Perot, or let's say the Dixiecrats in '48. I don't think they took votes away from either to hand it. But I think certainly 1912, absolutely, the Roosevelt on the ticket siphoned enough off of Taft that the person who was about the same popularity as the other two ends up winning the presidency because of that. And this is why in a two-party system, to go back to your earlier point of keeping your coalition together when you have heterogeneous support, you got to keep them all happy. And if you want to be a viable party in a two-party system, you have to do what you can to prevent that factionalization. And the Republicans did a poor job of that in 1912. And I think part of it's personality, the difference between Taft and Teddy, what Teddy thought Taft was going to be. I think in 92, Perot brought people out to vote who otherwise probably would have sat out the election. And I don't think it had much effect on the relative outcome between Bush and Clinton. I don't know for sure, but my dissertation was on how it affected House races. And I think it had an effect on House races because Perot brought a lot of people to the election who leaned Republican, but like Perot, they wouldn't have voted for Bush, but they did vote for Republicans in House races in the next few elections.
Right.
So these are some of the effects that third parties can have that are more subtle, but outside of spoiler, they haven't had much success.
Yeah, because that's one thing that both sides use. Like if you don't vote for either of the major candidates who have a good shot of winning, you're just throwing your vote, or you're spoiling the party, or you're doing whatever.
Right.
Kind of like with the Tea Party candidates, they, instead of running as a third party, they said we don't want to splinter the party. We're just going to have to run a convention like Ted Cruz, for instance. He should have ran as a Tea Party candidate, but he decided to run as a Republican because he does not want to deliver the presidency to Hillary Clinton,
right,
and then avoid having been labeled and being a pariah for the rest of his political career. So, yeah, so this is really great, Robert. I mean, I appreciate you being here. Just one last thought on this. If the election is held tomorrow, you said like Trump has a slight edge on winning. That's basically the projections. Does either administration gonna have a bigger impact on ending the situation in the Middle East? Often, right now, we don't talk too much about Russia and Ukraine anymore. It's not dominating the news as much as it used to. But basically, the current issue we have in the support of Israel, and then are they in the support that we are giving them? Do you think either candidate or either administration is going to have more sway, or do you think the United States should have more impact in controlling the situation in the Middle East more than it has so far?
I think that a Harris administration would be far more, I don't want to use the word cautious, but either administration is going to be much more pro-Israel than not. The question is just how much. I think a Harris administration would certainly try to minimize Israel's chance of excess. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, this is the history there is long, and it can be very ugly at times. And I think that vengeance is something that the Harris administration is less likely to support than the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration would likely, I don't want to say give a blank check to Israel, but I think they'd be far less likely to question Israel unless they did something really, really atrocious. Where I think the Harris administration would support Israel by and large, but do so with stern warnings about don't do this, don't do that, like talking about certain weaponry that might be less guided, that we're not going to give you the kind of ordnance you need that might be more likely to cause civilian casualties because you have less control over its guidance, et cetera. I think either one is certainly going to play favorite towards Israel. I just think that the Trump administration is less likely to question Israel and its motives and its tactics towards that end. Now, will that end the conflict there? No, I don't think that's happening anytime soon. There's just too much history of rivalry in that area. But I think, I don't know. It's kind of like the beginning of World War I. Both sides think if they just get to do what they want, then we can end this quickly. And of course, that's never the case. But I do think that there would be a difference in approach, that the Trump administration would be far less likely to be critical of Israel while supporting them, where the Harris administration would be critical while supporting them.
And again, we don't want to talk. I mean, maybe one of those days we'll do one about international politics. But just what do you think about? A lot of people think that Netanyahu is expanding the realm of the war into Hezbollah, and then maybe possibly potentially Iran. And a lot of people thinking that he's using that as a political survival tool, because the minute the whole thing is going to subside, he's probably going to either be sitting at home or sitting in jail or losing the election or whatever the case might be. How much you think that's what's happening right now, the expansion of the war at all fronts, is a political survival and a maneuver by Netanyahu?
I really don't know enough about his motivations, at least, and I don't know enough about Israeli politics domestically to say. I know he's been, at a position of having very fragile grips on power. He's lost it for a little bit. Historically, they build coalitions of a multi-party system where you have to have a lot of cooperation and no one has an outright majority. So I don't know. I think a lot of the expansion of the conflict recently has been to strike back at specific actions taken against them, and in some cases more indirectly, like going after the Houthis or going after Iran. But I don't know if that's, whenever you engage in more conflict, you run the risk of making your people angry at you for engaging in excessive conflict. On the other hand, some countries, they believe in the response to war with further aggression is just. I don't know enough about Israeli public opinion to know how that interaction. So I don't know why he's doing it. Certainly, he's not picking random targets around the area to go after, but that certainly doesn't mean he has to strike back with the same vigor that he believes has happened to Israel. So domestically, I don't know what to tell you. Now, if he's facing prosecution for corruption or whatever it might have been, I'm not sure how this helps. It may delay it, but if that's inevitable, if there's legitimate evidence, I'm not sure what this does. But I see more of it as a containment, and the internal politics may play a role, but I don't know enough about it to say.
It seems like the way the Israeli government and Netanyahu in particular celebrating the assassination of political leaders on the other side, from Hezbollah, Iran, and Hamas, obviously. Today, for instance, the assassination of Sinwar, right. And then a few weeks back with Hassan Nasrallah, and then the president. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. And then Ismail Haniyeh, the guy who was in Iran, he was from Hamas also. So all those political assassinations seems like he's trying to utilize that as a payoff for like what happened in October 7th. I mean, yeah, what happened is pretty bad, but I was able to deliver all the people somehow responsible for bringing this whole thing into it. So he's trying to kind of like to really utilize that as a political tool to become a little bit more popular, at least with some segment of the population that he has lost, support for. People are still accusing him of not really doing what he can to releasing the hostages, and he's saying, "Okay, I was unable to do this, but look what I was able to kind of like." The more he stays in the game, it seems like the more he has to gain by what he is able to deliver from a political standpoint for his constituency. It seems like that's what he's doing.
Could
we'll
be.
See what happens. Yeah. So again, Robert, thank you so much for this, and I know we ended
You're
on
very
this.
welcome.
But gonna go back. So it's within the margin of error. So it's anyone's game, right?
Yeah, I think
everybody it's like a basketball analogy. Everybody got 100 points. There's 30 seconds left, and then whoever is gonna do a Hail Mary shot might up able to win. So let's see.
Whoever holds the ball last is likely to win. And if you look at the 7 states that are apparently the swing states, I think in every state it's within the margin of error. In fact, I have I think, yeah, with maybe the except now, even Florida, I think it's we're in the margin of error. I mean, it's kind of the edge of the margin,
Okay.
but of all the 7 or 8 swing states, it's certainly no one should feel like they safely know.
Okay. Now, just kind of like bring it home a little bit. I know Texas is not a purple state, even it should be, but it's not. And it came closer in 2016, 2020. It's like now in single digits. What's your projection on the night of the election? Texas is going to go still Republican, or it has the
I would
potential
say
of going
Republican by 6 points. It's my
by
guess.
6 or 7 points? Okay, that's my prediction as well. All right, Robert. Well, thank you so much again. And then at some point, maybe after the election, we'll talk about whoever is going to win and what they're going to do, and then we'll talk about this whole thing again. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
we can
And thank you
revisit
so
this
much.
and talk. I can explain why I was wrong.
All right, Robert. Thank you so much.
See you later. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you all for being here today. And then we just finished concluding the episode with Poly Talk with Professor Robert Yowell regarding the upcoming elections. And we talked about also the conflict in the Middle East, and then the likelihood of which administration and how they're going to be viewing and then managing the conflict in their own perspective. Thank you, Robert, and thank you for all the audience. And then looking forward to talking to you soon. Thank you.